Oh my God, I wish I had a good one for you. What I can tell you is that most Russian crude, about 70%, is produced in the permafrost. And because the Russian demographic is terminal, and because the Russian educational system collapsed 30 years ago, there's only a very small cadre of skilled workers that are actually trained up to do the work in the permafrost. And they're on average in their late 50s now. So there's not a lot of them. They're literally dying out. And without Western tech and above all else, Western workers, the ability of the Russians to keep this stuff flowing is very much called into question. And that's before you consider war, sanctions, or boycotts, all of which are having their own impact. So we need to plan for a not too distant future when Russian crude exports just aren't there. Now, in that scenario, especially if it happens suddenly, we're going to have a significant price shock around the world. And then you have to look to Washington. Because in Washington, the American president has the authority to end oil exports with the stroke of a pen. It doesn't have to go to Congress. That authority was already granted back in 2015. And since Biden is the most economically populist president we've ever had, there is no way he is going to expose the American consumer, the American voter, to high and volatile global prices if he doesn't have to. So the question just isn't when will the Russian stuff go offline? It's how much American stuff goes on offline with it. And if the world loses American and Russian crude at the same time, you're probably looking at crude prices never dropping below 150 again. And you're probably looking at a captured price in North America where they never rise above 70 again. Probably. There's a lot of ifs and statements linked to that prediction. Well, any sector you're going to be able to find companies that are in problems. The one I am by far the most concerned about on a global basis is America's Apple. Starting with what's going on in the tech sector, the pace of technological advance is going to slow considerably. And if Apple can no longer release a new version every 6 months, that's obviously going to hit their bottom line. But more importantly, roughly 90% of the supply chain steps that go into the average iPhone touch the People's Republic of China in some way. Now, a lot of that is going to be more on the low value add and assembly, but that's not nothing either. And without the Chinese as part of the supply system, it's going to take Apple at least 5 years to rebuild that supply chain capacity in other parts of the world. Now, most companies, I would say that would be the kiss of death. But this is Apple, and they've got a giant cash cow, and they've got a giant war chest, so they can afford to do that. But it's going to take them a lot of time. You can break even on your carbon debt in a matter of a couple of years, and maybe even economically a few after that. The problem is that Tesla data assumes that your electric vehicle was fabricated with 100% green energy and is fueled by 100% green energy, and that is just not the case. Most of the processing and most of the middle steps in manufacturing are powered by soft brown coal in China, and then even in California, only half of the grid is green. And then, of course, and this might be a shock to some people, people are relying more on solar than wind in most places. But there has never been a day where the wind shines at night, which is when most people are going to be recharging their cars. So even if you've got a reasonably clean grid, you're still probably charging your car with fossil fuel energy. So that story probably isn't there yet. The technology may evolve, and if the technology evolves, I reserve the right to change my mind. But today, no. In addition, if we're serious about doing this with the technology we have today, then the build-out needs a lot more power plants for solar and wind, a lot more transmission, a huge number of battery systems to replace all those peaker plants, in addition to electrifying transport. That means we need 3 times as much copper, 10 times as much nickel, 18 times as much graphite, 12 times as much lithium, and on and on and on. And we need it all by 2030. There has never been a decade in human history where we've been using an industrial material and we've doubled its availability in a 10-year period. And now we have to do that and more for 11 different materials? No, cannot do it. So what's going to happen this decade is there's going to be a bit of a come to Jesus moment within the green community when they realize that the dreams cannot match the realities. And that means one of 2 things will have to happen. Number one, the dream will have to change to something that's more realistic. Or The one country with the military capacity to do it goes out and secures the sources of these materials for themselves. Because while the world couldn't do the green transition with today's tech, the United States might be able to. But that means taking all of those things off the global market. We're going through quite a churn right now as the baby boomers are removed from the system. We've had an environment of extraordinarily cheap capital that has lasted an extraordinarily long time, and there's just going to be a lot of shakeout. There's no way around that. We're all going to have to get used to a new operating environment. But if you fast forward just 2 or 3 years, when the vast majority of that money is gone, anyone who still has capital to deploy in that environment will discover that there's not a lot of competition in capital holders because the next generation, Gen X, is so much smaller. So you should expect the rate of returns 3 years from now to be significantly better on average than anything we've seen in the last 20 years, which means that financial planners will actually have to do their job and have to look for things that are companies that bring value and that aren't just being manipulated by cheap capital. For the investor, this is about to get a lot easier. For the investment professional, it's about to get a lot more competitive. Well, it's kind of funny because sometimes people have labeled me as the America's greatest purveyor of doom porn. So it's difficult to remain too cheery, but a couple of things. Number one, we are going through a period of extreme change. And yes, that means a lot of dislocation and destruction. But this isn't the end of the human condition. This isn't the end of America or Australia, maybe the end of China. And so we know we will get through this. Our systems are stable. Our demographics are pretty good. Our finances are about as good as you can get. We will get through this. And in the case of the United States, if we're really losing access to materials processing and manufacturing, out of both China and Germany at more or less the same time, that means here in North America, we need to double the size of the industrial plant. And yes, that means inflation will be high for a good long time. But it's also going to be the greatest growth story in the history of my country and Mexico and Canada. And on the backside of this, we will have built a supply chain system that uses less workers, is more capital efficient, is more energy efficient, that employs locals to serve local markets, that's cleaner, that's more responsible, and it'll be largely resistant to international shocks. This is a good story. We just have to get from here to there. Let's put the financial question to the side for just a moment. We'll come back to it. Let's talk about everything else. Everything else looks pretty good. Yes, you have gone hook, line, and sinker supplying commodities to a price-insensitive Chinese market. And yes, as China breaks down, you're going to feel that. That's unavoidable. But you have far better relations with the nations of Southeast Asia, which collectively are going to pick up a lot of the pieces that the Chinese are going to drop as their industry collapses. They're not as price insensitive. It'll be slower growth, but it'll be more sustainable and more healthy moving forward. That is also a good story. I would also say there's an opportunity here for Australia to do something that it has shunned doing until now, and that's moving up the value-added scale yourself. A lot of those materials processing that the Americans are so paranoid about, guess who's got the raw materials? Guess who has some of the cheapest energy in the world? There's no reason that Australia can't play a role in upgrading the lithium and everything else that the modern world is going to need. And you also have the skill sets to do it. And you can even do it in green power in a way that we can't do it in the United States because your solar potential is